this episode of Newt's World, it's no secret that our government-run public education system has held generations of Americans hostage. The teachers' unions have been hard at work running a mass misinformation campaign to convince parents that because this is how it has always been, this is how it has to be. But here's what you may not realize. The parents are winning, and we are nearing the end of the education dictatorship. The school choice revolution is here, and moms and dads are successfully restoring parental rights in education, state by state and one school district at a time. In his new book, The Parent Revolution, Dr. Corey DeAngelis, an influential advocate of school choice, argues why parents and political leaders must lean into the culture war taking place in schools. Here to discuss his new book, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Dr. Corey DeAngelis. He is the Executive Director at Educational Freedom Institute, a Senior Fellow at the American Federation for Children, and a Visiting Fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Corey, welcome and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
You begin your book by talking about how you were given the opportunity to attend a magnet school for high school, which was physically located on the same campus as the public school. What were the differences that you saw between the magnet school and the public school?
Yeah, at the magnet school, there was high expectations and people wanted to be there. There was a specialized mission as well. It was a communications school. And so hopefully that has helped me with my employment nowadays. But look, at the government-run school that I was assigned to, they had monopoly power because if you want to go somewhere else, in most cases, you got to pick up and move houses to be assigned to a better quote-unquote public school, or you got to pay out of pocket to pay for private school tuition and fees in addition to what you're paying for the assigned school through property and other tax revenues as well. And there was a lot of bullying, fighting, there was drugs, gang activity at the residentially assigned school. And I was able to see the night and day difference for 4 years right before my eyes. And I think other families should have educational opportunities too, but it shouldn't be limited to schools that are run by the government. Yes, magnet schools are a step in the right direction, but every family should be able to take their kids' education dollars to the school that works best for them, whether that's a public school, a private school, a charter school, or a home-based education option. The money should follow the student. And thankfully, now that the teachers' unions have overplayed their hand during COVID, they fought to keep the schools closed as long as possible. They woke up parents. They showed families what was happening in the classroom. They were focusing more on indoctrination than education. Now we have 12 states in the past 3 years alone going all in on school choice, passing Milton Friedman's vision of universal school choice. Finally, no more picking winners and losers. We've gone from 0 to 100 on the issue, and it's glorious to see.
I'm curious because you have a PhD in education policy from the University of Arkansas. Have you always focused on school choice?
Basically the entire time. When I was doing my PhD in education policy, my first study actually linked the Milwaukee voucher program. It started in 1990 to long-term reductions in crime. I had student-level data from the longitudinal evaluation of the program, and my co-author, Patrick Wolf, who's still at the University of Arkansas, he's my professor there, we looked at student-level data until the students became about 30 years of age and found about a 50% reduction in drug-related crimes and also a 38% reduction in paternity disputes. And so from the very start of my program at Arkansas, I was very interested in school choice. Since then, I've published about 30 to 40 peer-reviewed articles on the topic. And before I did my PhD, I did a bachelor's and a master's in economics at the University of Texas at San Antonio, where I live now. And my advisor there was named John Merrifield. He did some of the initial evaluations of some of the school choice initiatives in San Antonio, Texas. They had a pilot program, and he had found improvements in the public schools too. So school choice has been a rising tide that lifts all boats. But viewing the school system as an economist really opened my eyes to the problems of monopoly power. Just imagine if you were assigned to your nearest grocery store or restaurant and you couldn't access another opportunity unless you moved houses or you paid twice. The restaurant could serve you rotten food, you'd get food poisoning, or maybe they'd even have empty shelves and you'd have no recourse because that would be a monopoly scenario. And that's exactly how the school system works today. And I don't really blame the people in the system. I blame the system itself. And we saw this play out during COVID. It got so bad that the schools knew they could keep their doors closed and the union bosses would keep their money flowing. They keep the gravy train going. And families were had nowhere else to go. They were scrambling, trying to figure out how to get their kids into the private schools that were open. They were trying to figure out homeschooling, and the government schools got to keep the same money. But it was even worse than that. They had a perverse incentive to keep the schools closed because they could profit by leveraging those closures. They could hold children's education hostage to secure billions of dollars in ransom payments from taxpayers. But again, they overplayed their hand and awakened a sleeping giant. Parents who have become the new union, the kids union, the new special interest group in town, more of a general interest because they're fighting for their own kids and they're winning on the issue. We saw how the School Boards Association tried to bully and silence parents into submission when parents were pushing back at school board meetings because the unions have always told us, if you disagree with what's happening in the schools, we're accountable. We have democratic accountability. You can show up at the school board meetings and things will be fine. Well, things weren't fine. They only wanted to hear from parents if we actually agreed with them. And so they tried to actually weaponize the federal government. They sent a letter to Biden implying that parents under the Patriot Act of all things should be investigated for quote unquote domestic terrorism. And earlier drafts of that letter actually called for the military and the National Guard to be deployed to school board meetings to tell parents to sit down and to shut up because they disagree with the status quo. Well, since then, 26 states have left the National School Boards Association. So they basically imploded, and it's their own fault. It's a story of optimism, really, because it shows that parents, when they fight for something together, when they lock arms, they can win on the issue.
Tell me just a minute and share with our listeners the cost of bad education at a human level. I mean, what we've been doing to children by trapping them in places that don't work.
It obviously hurts their academic outcomes. You look at Baltimore public schools, for example. They have 40% of their high schools have 0% math proficiency rates. Not a single kid can do math at grade level in 40% of Baltimore public schools. And guess what? We spend so much money in the school system nationwide. Since 1970, we've increased per student education expenditures by about 170% after adjusting for inflation. Have the outcomes gotten 170% better? Obviously not. They've been flat or gotten worse in some cases. In places like New York City, they spend about $40,000 per student per year. Nationwide, it's about $20,000 per student per year, which is a lot of money. And the private schools, on average, nationwide, the tuition is only about $12,000 to $13,000 per student per year. The unions know their schools aren't working. You look at Stacey Davis Gates. She's the head of the Chicago Teachers Union. Just a couple years ago, she had the audacity to call school choice racist. And guess what we found this year? She sends her own kid to a private school. I mean, the hypocrisy is never ending. We see this with Joe Biden. He went to private school. He sent his kids to private school. And I don't blame my ideological enemies for this. Everybody should seek out the best educational opportunities for their kids, but you shouldn't turn around, pull the ladder up from behind yourself, and then fight against educational opportunities for others. But this is not just an academic failure for children. It also fails them on an emotional level. We saw with the school closures, this hurt kids mentally, it hurt them socially, and it also led to physical changes in children as well. And this can include changes in behaviors later on in life. So this is why probably in our study and in 5 other peer-reviewed studies that have all found more school choice, less likelihood to commit crime. So having a failing education system does not just lower test scores. It can negatively impact the kids for the rest of their lives, and not just in academic settings. It can lower their incomes. It can make them more likely to end up in jail. And that also hurts the rest of society, because if you want to be in a safe society, crime's obviously a bad thing. Having more gross domestic product is obviously a good thing for a country too. And so school choice doesn't just benefit you, it benefits all of society.
The fact that the Baltimore City schools are so unimaginably bad, and yet I think they're the third most expensive public schools in the country per student. This is a two-level question. Part one, how do you explain how you could have over 2,000 students and not a single one can pass math?
This is just how monopolies operate. They have no incentive to spend additional dollars wisely. So you can spend $1 billion per kid and still get the same results if you don't fundamentally change the incentives in the system. So this is not just a problem in Baltimore, it's other areas all across the country. And we found in places like Florida, where they do have universal school choice, where everybody can choose to take their education money wherever they want to go, whether that's in the public, private, or homeschool sectors, the public schools have gotten a lot better. A couple decades ago, Florida was at the bottom of the pack when it came to the nation's report card. Now, fast forward to today, if you control for student demographics across states, Florida is the top 5, depending on the outcome you're looking at. And guess what? They spend a lot less than the national average. And there have been 11 academic studies in Florida too, 10 of them positive. More school choice, better outcomes in the public schools. It's been a rising tide that lifts all boats. And the U.S. News and World Report has also came out this year showing Florida at the #1 ranking when it comes to their education system. So this is really a win-win solution. It's not just a win for the kids who get to choose. It obviously is a win for families who get to put their kids in institutions that align with their values, but it's also a win for the kids who remain in the traditional system too, because school choice is a rising tide that lifts all boats. Public schools have to up their game in response to competition. And we see this in every other industry in the country. So it shouldn't surprise us all that much when we see nationwide, there have been 29 studies on this topic, 26 of them positive. More school choice, better outcomes in the public schools.
How can you have parents who know that their children are trapped in a system in which no one, not one, is learning math, and not have a parental rebellion in Baltimore City? What's the underlying dynamic in your judgment?
It's starting in a lot of other areas, but the problem is education has been one of the lower rung voting issues, right? Out of 10 issues, education is probably 9 or 10 on the list of priorities. But it doesn't always need to be that way. If you have at least one party leading on the issue, the other party will have to respond. And we saw this kind of play out in Virginia with Glenn Youngkin, the Republican, in 2021. In a state that went 10 points to Biden the year before, Terry McAuliffe, the Democrat former governor of the state, basically an incumbent, he lost to Glenn Youngkin on the issue of education by 6 points with education voters, and that was the #2 issue in the election. And that's because Terry McAuliffe on the last debate stage, he really stepped in it. He let the mask slip when he said, I don't think parents should be telling schools what they should teach. And he even quadrupled down on his anti-parent rhetoric right up until Election Day, the night before the election. He had Randy Weingarten, of all people, stumping for him the night before the election. The school closer was his campaign closer. And the next day on CNN, a Virginia mom said that that was, quote, the nail in the coffin moment for her. So it could become an issue. It really depends on whether the GOP wants to pick up the football and become the parents' party and make it into a voting issue. We saw this in Florida too with DeSantis. In 2018, he barely won. Not a lot of people remember this because in 2022, he won by 20 points. But in 2018, DeSantis barely squeaked by a fraction of a point. And a lot of people thought his Democrat opponent, Andrew Gillum, was going to win. The headline in the Wall Street Journal the next day was that, quote, school choice moms tipped the governor's race in Florida. They were looking at CNN exit polling, finding that Black moms in particular came out in force for DeSantis because why? Well, his opponent, Andrew Gillum, a Black Democrat, actually called to get rid of the private school choice program in the state that was successfully working for over 100,000 kids at the time, disproportionately low-income kids and non-white kids as well. And so the story there is that these moms who might have disagreed with DeSantis on a lot of other issues turned that into a single issue priority for them. They wanted their kid to get a better education. They wanted the scholarship to have a better future for their child than the opportunities that they had. So it's almost like a chicken and the egg issue, though. In Florida, there's something that could be taken away. In Baltimore, they don't have universal school choice like they do have in Florida. So that's less likely to become a huge issue. But if parents do lock arms, they can become influential. The problem is the Democratic Party in places like Deep Blue Baltimore are a wholly owned subsidiary of the teachers' unions. You look at Randy Weingarten's union, the American Federation of Teachers, 99.9% of her campaign contributions in 2022 went to Democrats. It's a money laundering operation. It ought to be illegal. So while education freedom is not a partisan issue among voters, you ask voters, they support it. Among Republicans, Democrats, and independents, there's supermajority support for school choice. But the unions control the elected Democrats because of money and power. And politicians, in too many cases, respond more to power than logic or morality. But if enough Democrats were smart, they'd lock arms too, and the unions wouldn't be able to control them anymore. There are left-leaning arguments and right-leaning arguments you can make for school choice. It's an equalizer. The least advantaged are stuck in the most objectively failing government-run institutions. And people from all backgrounds, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, all racial backgrounds, benefit from having more choice in education. The problem is the unions.
When you look at the scale of the union money, the amount of power they have, how do they amass that much power?
They get to extort funding from the taxpayers. Look at how much we allocate towards K-12 education any given year. It's about $800 billion towards K-12 education. You look at state education budgets. You look at state budgets overall. It tends to be about a third to a half of the total budget that an entire state allocates towards everything. It goes towards the government-run school system. And so the unions, they get that money funneling to them, and then they funnel it to campaign coffers that are run by Democrats. 99.9% of the campaign contributions from the American Federation of Teachers, for example, consistently goes to the Democrats. And so it's a money laundering operation. It ought to be illegal. Public sector unions basically get to lobby against the public and use our own money against us. That's why even FDR called to eliminate public sector unions. In the private sector, I don't really have that much problem with unions because, look, if Walmart employees wanted to go on strike for whatever reason, well, guess what? The employer would feel the pain. But when it comes to the government-run school system, like we saw with COVID, when they closed the schools, the employers didn't feel the pain. The customers felt the pain. And so it's a failed feedback loop. You're in this never-ending cycle of failure, and it's because of the nature of public sector unions. How do we fix that? We get school choice. Instead of the families feeling the pain when the unions do something wrong, maybe the unions should feel some of the pain. Maybe they should have skin in the game, and maybe their employer, the school districts, will have some of the downsides as well. Parents shouldn't be stuck in the crossfires. Kids should not be used as bargaining chips, but we've seen that happen for far too long because the money does not follow the child. We can incentivize the teachers' unions to do a better job and the districts by letting the money follow the child. Only then will the school system cater to the needs of families and their children as opposed to the other way around.
Part of that is the clear case that Catholic schools seem to do dramatically better based on what you've seen and looked at. Why do you think the Catholic schools do so consistently better than their public school counterpart?
Because of incentives. I mean, look at during the COVID era, they were open. The Catholic schools were open in large part all across the country. The government schools were closed. And they cost a lot less on average as well relative to the government-run schools. So in Chicago, where Stacey Davis Gates, the Chicago Teachers Union boss who said school choice was racist, but sends her own kid to a private school, she sends her son to a Catholic school that has a tuition about $15,000 per year. But the government-run schools in Chicago that are unionized spend twice as much. It's about $30,000 per student per year in Chicago public schools. So it's not a money issue, it's an incentive issue. And the Catholic schools have been around for a long time. There's been another study by Michael Hartney and Leslie Finger. In fact, it's peer-reviewed. They found during the COVID era that in an area where you had more Catholic schools, the public schools are actually more likely to open their doors for business too, all else equal, even controlling for incidents of the virus and so on and so forth. The public schools upped their game in response to competition because Catholic schools tend to be lower cost than most private schools. And parents knew that they could vote with their feet. The public schools knew that too. So because there was an exit option that was open, they said, maybe we should open as well, or else we're going to lose some of that funding because public schools are funded based on how many kids they have enrolled in the system. Catholic schools have done great. It's correct. I think the Wall Street Journal reported this, that if all Catholic schools were grouped together as a state, they'd be the number one on the nation's report card, the number one state. And if you looked over time, although the government schools lost decades of learning during the COVID era from 2019 to 2022, Catholic schools found there was no statistically significant drop in test scores for Catholic schools, no matter what outcome you looked at, whether it was math or reading or 4th or 8th grade outcomes.
I want to reinforce your point about parents. We run a project called the America's New Majority Project, which people can see if they go online to americasnewmajorityproject.com. And we asked the question about parents' rights, and 84% of the country, 84%, more than 8 out of every 10 Americans, believe that parents have a right to know what is going on in their children's classroom. And as you know, the teachers union is bitterly opposed to parents being able to know that. And yet the country at large, Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, young, old, there's an 84% majority in favor. I think it was 11% opposed. And in that sense, there's an underlying core cultural value that I think you've sort of put your finger on. That's really a big deal. And I think something that getting back to parents being involved is really a key part of this. And as I understand it, in some states, the fact that the private schools stayed open put enormous pressure to reopen the public schools. But in states that have only a monopoly, they just stayed closed like forever.
Yeah, in Chicago, 2 weeks to slow the spread turned into 2 years to flatten a generation. They were actually striking in 2022. They deleted a tweet claiming, quote, "The push to reopen schools is rooted in sexism, racism, and misogyny." They even created an interpretive dance video. It was totally embarrassing to protest reopening schools. At the same time, they had a board member for Chicago Teachers Union vacationing in Puerto Rico, thousands of miles away, while saying it was too unsafe to go back to work in person. It was just so much hypocrisy on full display. In Los Angeles, they had a report on reopening schools. They called for more money. We knew that was going to happen, but they also called for unrelated political demands, including police-free schools, Medicare for all, a wealth tax, and guess what? They also called for a ban on charter schools. All these things that had zero to do with safely reopening schools. They overplayed their hand. This is partially why I actually dedicated my book, The Parent Revolution, to Randy Weingarten and the teachers unions for inadvertently doing more to advance school choice and homeschooling than anyone could have ever imagined, because families got to see that the school's curriculum wasn't aligned with their values. Through the Zoom school that was a failure in so many ways academically, parents got to look at the political indoctrination that was injected into the schools, the Marxist ideologies that were dividing children based on immutable characteristics. We now have 12 states with universal school choice. And in 2020, we had 0. So we've come so far in such a short amount of time. We've had more advancements on the school choice front in the past 3 years than we've had in the preceding 3 decades. It's hard to overstate how far we've come. And I think the unions are so drunk on power, and they have been for so long, they're not going to be able to reverse course. And ultimately, that's good news for parents and families in the long run, in that it's only going to continue adding fuel to the fire for the parent revolution. And my hope is that the more that the GOP leans into parental rights as a political winner, the more it becomes a form of political suicide for Democrats to oppose it. We saw what happened with Terry McAuliffe in Virginia. We've seen what happened with the National School Boards Association. And in my home state of Texas, it's really become a GOP litmus test issue. We passed universal school choice through the Senate last year easily, 18-13. The bill moved over to the House, where 21 so-called Republicans voted with all the Democrats against their own party platform issue of school choice, and killed the bill despite it being pushed very heavily by an education freedom fighter in my state, the governor, Greg Abbott. Well, guess what? After the primaries, out of those 21 guys who voted against school choice, 14 of them are gone, which basically never happens. Incumbents usually win 95% of the time. That trend has been inverted in Texas. It was a political earthquake. And that's ultimately going to lead to some Democrats saying, look, we're losing votes on the issue. Maybe we should come along too. And we saw that in Louisiana, which Louisiana just became the 12th state to pass universal school choice. It's the most recent one to do so this year, with Governor Landry signing very recently. And 20% of their House Democrats actually voted for the bill. They didn't need a single Democrat to vote for it. They had supermajorities of Republicans. They passed the bill very easily through both chambers. But we now have some Democrats defecting on the issue. Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, he was up in the polls by double digits in 2022 when he was running for governor. He was the attorney general at the time. And guess what? His opponent, Doug Mastriano, started calling Josh Shapiro, the Democrat, a hypocrite on the issue. Doug Mastriano said, well, look, you went to private school. I support school choice. Why don't you? You seem to be a hypocrite on the issue. Coincidentally, right after that, Josh Shapiro changed his education platform to include private school choice. He actually even went on Fox News the year afterwards in 2023, reiterating his support for school choice, and he's still doing so this year as well. He ultimately caved to the teachers unions, who gave him over $700,000 to his campaign in 2022. But the reason I bring that up is it reminds me of something that Milton Friedman said long ago. He said that the way that you change things is not by getting the right people into office. Obviously, that can help if they vote for the right policies. But Milton Friedman said the way that you truly change things is by creating a climate of opinion where it becomes politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing. And I think we're reaching escape velocity on school choice. I don't know when California is going to get it done, but look, we've had defections in states like North Carolina and Georgia. Sitting legislators in the House of Representatives in both states have flipped from the Democrat Party to the GOP on the issue of school choice. And we saw this in Missouri. There were consequential votes from Democrats this year to expand school choice. In Nebraska, they passed their first school choice program this year, and they had a consequential vote from a Democrat named Justin Wayne. These are movements in the right direction. This is bipartisan support that I welcome, and hopefully through hyperpartisanship in the short run, it will lead to bipartisan support among elected officials in the long run.
We talked about school choice, but what about the dramatic increase in homeschooling that seemed to come out of COVID? What's your personal feeling about homeschooling, and how significant a part of this story is homeschooling?
I think that's huge. I think it is the purest form of raising your own kids and not outsourcing it to a private entity or a government-run entity. I'm all aboard with homeschooling, but when it comes to school choice, look, I think it really depends on the individual family and what they can figure out to work for their own situation. This isn't public versus private. This isn't homeschooling versus government-run schooling. This is about choice and families having the opportunity that works best for them. I think homeschooling has a lot of benefits, though. I mean, a lot of people might say, oh, well, there might not be as much socialization. Well, guess what? A lot of the socialization that I experience in government-run schools is not a positive form of socialization. So the drugs, the gang activity, the fights. We had kids playing a game that they called 10 seconds. That was popular at my middle school. And what it was, where you would just fight for 10 seconds. And that was the name of the game. And people were getting rolled into gangs in the bathrooms. That's socialization of a form, but it's not a form of socialization that I want for my kids. You can also learn more at a fraction of the time. And you can also capitalize on positive forms of socialization. You can enroll your kid in a sport. You can have homeschool co-ops or hybrid homeschooling. So you can integrate socialization as well while still getting the one-on-one benefits of homeschooling at the same time. So there's better ways and not as good ways to do it.
Yeah, it's probably too radical a concept for this particular conversation, but the truth is, prior to the relatively recent past, you didn't have adolescence. You were a child and then you were an adult. And as an adult, you did adult things. And what we've done is we've trapped millions of kids right around puberty into sitting in rooms where they're bored and where we have allowed them to create their own culture. And it's a little bit like Lord of the Flies. I mean, having teenagers define a culture is a truly dumb idea.
I agree. I think the factory model of schooling can cause a lot of problems too, particularly for young boys, where they're taught that if they're fidgeting or if not just sitting there listening to the instructor, that they have a problem with them. And that's not to say that like ADHD is not a real issue. It's just more likely to happen to where if you try to claim that this kid has a problem because they're fidgeting, you might lead to over medication in the public school system of young children at the same time.
There's no question in my mind that Winston Churchill in the modern schools would have been heavily medicated by the fourth grade and would not have become Winston Churchill because they would have kept him too doped up, because he was really very difficult.
Yeah, and if you look at the history of the compulsory government-run school system in America, the roots came from modern-day Germany, Prussia. Horace Mann, the father of public education in America, went over to Prussia in the 19th century. The whole idea came from there, where the compulsory school system started to create obedient soldiers and obedient factory workers. And so when you see that outcomes aren't doing that great here in America today, when you see that it seems to be more about paying attention and listening to the current trend, and it happens to be a left-leaning trend today where that's the accepted ideology in the school system, that it's more about agreeing with them than it is about actually learning things. And some of the educators are more like indoctrinators. This isn't all of them, but some of them have gotten into it to control the minds of other people's children and to raise them in their socialist worldview. Again, that's not everybody, but that is a huge problem when it does happen to your kids. And it shouldn't surprise us all that much when we look at the roots of the government school system. So I'm happy that homeschooling has basically at least doubled relative to pre-pandemic levels. And the government school system's not happy about that. But look, you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. They fought to keep the doors closed, and parents figured out, hey, my kid's less anxious. They're doing a better job. They're learning more at a fraction of the time. And a lot of families who might not have ever tried homeschooling figured out that it could actually work.
I think that's exactly right. Look, Corey, I want to thank you for joining me. And your new book, The Parent Revolution, Rescuing Your Kids from the Radicals Ruining Our Schools, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. I think it's a must-read book for any parent concerned about their child's education today. And I want to let our listeners know they can find out more about your organization, Educational Freedom Institute, by visiting your website at efinstitute.org.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you to my guest, Corey DeAngelis. You can get a link to buy his new book, The Parent Revolution, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcast and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at Gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.